Hey, Chris and Jay here. We're going to teach you 5 simple techniques used to improve your production value and make your videos more cinematic. Paying attention to shot composition, lighting, and little details in post-production can make your final production look like a Hollywood movie.
So you're on set and you're ready to shoot. Well, before you can start recording, there are a few simple things you need to know about your camera to get the best results. We will be shooting on the Sony a7S, but this can apply to almost all DSLRs. The first thing you want to adjust before shooting is the aperture, or iris. The aperture controls the amount of light let through the camera lens. This can be adjusted with the dial on the front of the camera. The lower the number, the wider the aperture, the brighter the image. The higher the number, the more closed the aperture becomes and thus a darker image. An important tip for a more cinematic image is to have a wider aperture. The more open the aperture, the shallower the depth of field, or how blurry the foreground and background become. Adjust the aperture accordingly for the look you want. Now that your aperture is open, you have a nice blurred background, but the image is still too dark. The next line of defense against an underexposed image is the ISO. A camera's ISO controls how much light the sensor receives. Adjusting the ISO up brightens the image, but it also makes the image more grainy. Every camera has an ISO setting it looks its best at. That's called its native ISO. In our case, the a7S's native ISO is 3200, which is typically high for most DSLRs, but it's actually better to shoot a little overexposed on the a7S. Finally, the last thing is shutter speed. Shutter speed just controls how fast the internal shutter of the camera lets light onto the sensor. It works a lot like aperture. The lower the number, the more light is let into the sensor, except you never want to touch the shutter speed to adjust the image's brightness. Shutter speed is more important for the look of motion in an image. A lower shutter speed results in more motion blur, while a higher one creates a more crisp movement in the frame. For a more cinematic image, your shutter speed should be about double the frame rate of your camera. You're mostly shooting in 24 to 29 frames per second, so setting the shutter speed to about 1/60 results in the most realistic amount of motion blur. This is called the 180-degree shutter angle rule. Now that your camera is set up properly, Chris is going to explain to you proper cinematic framing of an image.
The framing of your image is extremely important for a more professional look. The most important rule of framing is the rule of thirds. Most camera LCD screens cut the image into thirds with 2 vertical and 2 horizontal lines, which act as a guide for the rule of thirds. Most people just place the subject in the center of the frame and call it a day. But by changing the framing of the camera so that the subject is filling only about 1/3 of the frame, this makes for a much more interesting and dynamic shot. Make sure when framing the subject using this rule, you give more space to whichever direction the subject is facing. So if they're facing more towards the right of the frame, you give them more room on the right side. Now your shot is looking more interesting, but you'll notice the image is still pretty flat and ugly. Let's go back to Jay for the importance of lighting.
So your image is framed nicely, but it still looks kind of dark and flat. Adding extra external light can make your image look much more cinematic. Using a light to light the side of the subject's face can help bring life to your image. This light is called the key light. Try not to face the key light directly at the center of the subject's face, but rather off to the side slightly to make the lighting more natural. Next, you need a backlight to separate the subject from the background. Set up a light, raise it higher than the subject, then point it down to highlight their shoulders and their head. This creates a sort of rim light around the subject, which helps them stand out more in the frame. Now that your scene is lit properly, the production value of your image has increased greatly. Lighting is extremely important. You may think you don't need it, but in reality, taking that extra time to set up the lights can push your video to the next level. You'll notice that having more control over the camera settings, image composition, and lighting all lead to a much more cinematic raw footage. Now that your RAW is looking nice, you can send it over to post-production to push it to the next level.
After all your RAW is imported into Final Cut Pro, we can make it even more cinematic by adding a 2351 crop to it. When you shoot your RAW footage out of a DSLR, it is in the aspect ratio of 16:9. Adding a 235 crop to a 16:9 image can give the illusion that your footage was shot on an anamorphic lens, which are typically used in big-budget Hollywood productions. To put it simply, 2351 crops are just the black bars you typically associate with movies. You can add these black bars by simply Googling images of 2351 crop. Then just overlay the image over your raw footage. If the image is greater than 1920 by 1080, just scale it down until it fits perfectly with the edges of your composition. Keep in mind this isn't a true 2351 crop, but it is a way to cheat your image into looking more cinematic. After adding the crop to your image, you may notice that it has messed with your framing a bit. Thanks to the crop though, you have some extra room to digitally reframe your shot and fix any framing issues that may have occurred. Just select your raw footage on the timeline below, go right to the transformation panel and adjust the position on the Y-axis to move your image up and down. Everything is looking great so far, but your image still isn't looking as good as it can. With a little bit of color correction and color grading, your final video can look just like the movies. So let's send the footage over to Jay to finalize the look.
Color correction and color grading are the most important parts of nailing the look and feel of your film. I will be showing you the most basic style of correction and grading. First, you want to correct your footage. Color correction is different than color grading. It's used to make all of your raw footage look the same and create more depth in an image. I start by adding contrast between the shadows and the midtones. Do this by taking the midtones and highlights and dragging them up a bit, then dragging the shadows down. This makes the shadows and black areas in the image darker. Use the midtones and highlights to adjust the brightness of your image as well. This process is all about preference, so you can tweak these settings accordingly to get the image you like the best. Once you have a color-corrected look that you like, you can move over to the color panel to add the icing on the cake. The most basic and most used color grade in films plays off the contrast between orange and blue. Big budget films like Transformers use a very extreme version of this, but I'm going to keep it simple. You can achieve this stylized look by taking the shadows and moving them towards the orange and red area of the color space, then drag them down. Doing this essentially begins to remove the orangish red colors from the shadows of your image, which gives it a more cool blue tone. Then you can grab your midtones and highlights knob, move them over to the orangish red area, and drag them up. This adds a warmer tone to the brighter areas in the image. Again, this is all preference, so just adjust the settings until you get the look you like. And there you have it. Just by taking the time to properly set up your camera, adjust your framing, add a little bit of lighting, and spicing up your image in post, you went from this to this. When shooting, always remember to shoot with these basic ideas in mind, and your production quality will improve greatly.